Hey, everybody. This is Monica Maybank with the Holy Politician Podcast. Welcome to the program. For those of you unfamiliar with this platform, the purpose of this podcast is to discuss issues related to politics and policy in America. So, naturally, that includes American culture. So, as a former federal lobbyist for nearly a decade, I had the great fortune of advocating on behalf of kids every single day in America's classrooms. And that gave me a unique insight and actually a front row experience to how legislation is made at the highest levels of our government. But it also opened my eyes to the truth of politics and policy and what happens when you read in between the lines of legislation and the entire lobbying experience. And so this platform was created with that experience in mind, but for Christians who vacillate between how to show up in the world, understand what's going on with the American populace while maintaining godly principles. And I know that that's extremely hard to do today. Many of us feel shackled to our jobs or shackled to our reputation, shackled to our influence or lack thereof, that we find it hard to speak out against things that are antithetical to truth. But we live in a time where we can no longer be silent. There is an urgency on our sound, and there is an urgency for truth. And so we see this more and more in all the different dynamics and the things that you see on the news, the things that you see happening in the education system, just in every facet of society. But we also see this more and more with the transgender movement in America. And this really is a movement that has been built on deception, delusion, and confusion, to be honest. And I've been doing my research and I read a lot of articles and I've read some peer-reviewed articles on this issue. And one interesting article that I first got my eyes on was a 2016 article that was entitled Sexuality and Gender: Findings from the Biological, Psychological, and Social Sciences. And this article basically said that the transgender phenomenon is not supported by scientific evidence. And there were two findings that were very unique to this study. One finding says that the hypothesis that gender identity is an innate, fixed property of human beings that is independent of biological sex, that a person might be a quote man trapped in a woman's body or a quote woman trapped in a man's body, is not supported by scientific evidence. According to a recent estimate, about 0.6% of US adults identify as a gender that does not correspond with their biological sex. So that's less than 1% of Americans that identify as being transgender. But even still, this phenomenon is gaining steam across the country, as you can see, particularly if you've been watching the news, with the first person to identify as trans soon to occupy the halls of Congress, the halls that I had the privilege of walking around for many, many years. And this is a man that calls himself Sarah. Now, what I find interesting about America is that America is very quick to say that there is no such thing as male privilege and there's no such thing as white privilege. Well, then tell me, how in the world do we have a white man that has just been voted into Congress saying that he is a white woman? And then how do we have white men competing in women's sports and we accept it and we tolerate it like it's normal, right? And then we have people like Tim McBride, who claims to be Sarah McBride, who decides that one day he wants to be a woman, and we believe him and we tolerate it and we participate in his charade or his movie or his acting experience when it's really not the real world, but we are acting like it's a real world. And so when we say that there's no such thing as privilege and yet we allow these things to permit and continue, don't tell me that's not privilege. And so I will wait for the day where a Black man dresses up in his costume, which might happen soon, and we permit and we act like it's normal, and he is occupying the halls of Congress. I don't know, maybe Tim McBride is opening the doors for that. But what I find very interesting about Tim McBride, who goes by Sarah as pretend, is that he married a trans man. And so you have this trans woman, AKA a man that dresses up in costume as a woman, that marries a trans man which is a woman dressing up as a man. And so basically, Tim really wanted to marry a woman. And so why didn't you just stop pretending and stop the charade in the game and just say, hey, maybe I'm feeling like a fetish. I want to dress up as a girl, but I really want to marry and sleep with a woman. Are you confused yet? Because this thing confuses me, right? You have a trans woman that marries a trans man, but they're supposed to be different. And so the whole thing is confusing. And so we're living again in a state of perpetual deception, delusion, and confusion. And we're not doing anything about it. We're remaining silent and we're just watching it all happen right in front of our eyes. But it's affecting our children now. And so that is what we all should really be concerned about the most. If adults want to be act silly, put on costume, play their charade, and play their games, that's one thing. But yet we endorse it because we're not doing anything about it. But when it starts to affect our children, if we still continue to say nothing, then that's the bigger issue, right? If I were to tell people, for example, hey, from now on, I want to be known as a white man, call me Bob Whitfield. Do we think that people would comply or does that sound ludicrous to you? Well, why doesn't it sound ludicrous and insane that we would allow and say that somebody could be called a woman who literally you're looking at them and you can see their Adam's apple? So the good thing about all of this is that people are actually starting to talk about it. We're starting to legislate on it. And even at the federal level, there are some things that are going to come down the pike and probably will be passed into law because, again, we have a trifecta now in Washington, D.C., which includes a majority controlled in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and a White House that is controlled by Republicans. So recently, Senator Marshall from Kansas hosted a panel, actually just last week, on what he calls the gender industrial complex. What is the gender industrial complex? Well, it's akin to the prison industrial complex. It's a moneymaker machine. And apparently, the gender industrial complex is a $4 billion a year industry. So, do you really think that they want to provide people with gender affirming care? Or do you think that the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, and every industry that is subsidiary to that wants to make money? It's a complex. It's a money-making machine. And that really is the nature of anything that is antithetical to truth. It's all about the money. And so Senator Marshall recently introduced what is known as the Defining Male and Female Act of 2024 in the Senate. And this would codify legal definitions of male and female, which who wouldn't even imagine that we would need something like this, right? But it ensures that things like the word sex is analogous with the word gender, and that it's based on biology and anatomy rather than ideology. And so these things are necessary now because when we have this confusion that is widespread and it's seeping into the classrooms of our children, then we need to make sure that there's some resounding voice and cry to stop this. And speaking of stop, another bill, a proposed bill that has yet to be introduced called the STOP Act or the Safeguarding the Overall Protection of Minors Act would fine doctors at least $100,000 if they provide minors with sex-altering surgeries or medications. And this proposal is being put in place by two senators, Senator Roger Marshall and Senator Tommy Tuberville. Now, really, we need to put anybody who does this underneath the jail, not in the jail, but underneath the jail. So not only do they need to be fined, but they need to be arrested and they need to be held accountable for mutilating our children. And so what we need to understand is that we are in this world. The Bible says we're in this world, but not of it. But that doesn't mean that we abdicate our responsibilities to speak out for truth. We still need to speak up. We still need to stand up. We still need to speak out even in our workplaces. Yes, and I recognize that that is hard to do. But if you're not taking a stand and standing up for truth in your workplace, then who is? When you are not speaking up and speaking out, then you're basically condoning and endorsing all of the foolishness that's taking place right underneath your nose. And so, what you need to do is to stay in a place of prayer, because there will be a time where God is going to compel you and convict you and nudge you to say something. And you need to be able to speak up and say it without the fear of what the consequence might be. Because what we need to mostly be afraid of is to fear God and to not fear man. We need to be able to have our face fixed like a flint so that we are not afraid of what man can do. The Bible says that man could kill the flesh, but we should be more afraid of who can kill and destroy the soul. So that's what I'm afraid of. I don't want anything to destroy my soul. And I don't want anything to be in the way of me being able to identify what is true and what is not true for the sake of my children and my children's children. So when you think about this word truth, what does it mean to you? How do you represent truth in your everyday life? And so the truth is what we know to be true, that God created them male and God created them female. He didn't create anything in between. He was very clear about this binary construct so that we can have reproduction in the earth and so that our lives could bring him glory. So that's my prayer, that your life would bring him the utmost glory in the earth. So if you have yet to subscribe to this channel, I would encourage you to do that. Share this video with your friends and your family and continue to pray for our country. Pray for our elected officials. Pray for those that are lobbying and advocating on the front lines on these issues and many more. So take care until I see you next time on the Holy Politician Podcast.